Hello everyone, welcome to Limbo. My name is João and today I have the pleasure to talk with Jake Bornstein. A couple of notes on the episode. So, just to give you some context, a couple of years ago I was laid off by this project that I had helped build, and that was really rough on me. And I made a tweet about it, and Jake reached out and said, "Hey, do you want to have a call about it?" And we talked for a while. He was a wonderful coach and made me feel like this was actually an opportunity to rethink my career, to rethink my skill set, and understand what's the next step, what's the next page in my career, in my professional life. And that really had an impact on me. And so being able to, a couple of years later, interview Jake is one of the, to be honest, is one of my favorite conversations in the podcast so far. Nothing against everyone else. I loved all of the guests, but this one really was special for me. And it was special because, well, first of all, if you follow my newsletter, and if you don't, you should, you know that it's called Metis. And the company that Jake is building is actually called Studio Metis. And so that was a fun thing. And the company is focused on helping organizations to basically thrive. And we talk about their approach to coaching, their approach to complexity, their approach to helping managers understand the difference between being a manager and a leader. We talked a lot about leadership, communication, and also about how do you go about coaching someone with a lot of data and at the same time not forgetting the human element, the emotional element. And yeah, it was such a wonderful conversation. I took so many notes. I've learned so much from this conversation, and I know that you will too. A quick note: for some reason, when we started the podcast, probably because I was really nervous, I call him Jack. That's not his name. His name is Jake, okay? That being said, I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Jake Bornstein. Please go follow Studio Metis on their newsletter and go follow Jake on his social media. That being said, a quick note from our sponsors. The first one is the Socratic Experience, the school where I work on. We're trying to revolutionize education through the Socratic method. You can know more about us at the socraticexperience.com. Limbo, the non-profit, sorry, not Limbo, Contexto, the non-profit that allows for Limbo to exist. And finally, the restaurant that gives name to the podcast, Limbo in Lisbon. If you're in Lisbon, go and visit Limbo. That being said, here's my wonderful conversation with Jake Bornstein. Hello everyone, welcome to Limbo. My name is João and today I have the pleasure to be talking with Jack Bornstein. Jack, thank you so much for being here. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. It's springtime. There's birds singing. Blossoms are coming out. It's spectacular. The world feels like it's coming alive.
Yeah, it is. It feels good after. I mean, do you prefer winter, spring, autumn, or summer? What's your favorite season of the year?
Oh, I really love every season, to be honest. I know it's a bit of a cop out, but there's something sort of beautiful about the cyclicality of it. I would say I love having four seasons relative to, places where it's sort of one note all the time, even if it's California and that note is beautiful.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I feel like that. I love every single thing or a bunch of different things actually in each of the seasons, but it always gets to the moment where I'm always happy that it's changing. So it's like now we're getting into spring and I really love winter, but I really need spring to come. So it's always like this balance of really enjoying it, but at the same time just shifts in beautifully in a moment. Yeah, well, Jake, thank you so much for taking the time. I know that you're a very busy guy. I mean, I'm not sure, but I look at how much you've done in terms of your experience, and I assume that that's the case. But before we're recording, we're just mentioning, and I want to make that public that in 2022, actually 2 years ago, when I was first laid off by a project that I was working on called Entrepreneurial Gym. I was kind of lost and I made a tweet talking about it, and eventually you actually replied to that tweet and we ended up having a conversation where you gave me a couple of career advice. And I just wanted to appreciate that because back then having someone who was basically just lost trying to understand what to do with his career, it's not about like having a call that changed my life, but the fact that you being such a like someone who has built so many different things, taking the time to actually meet with me, to listen to my problems and ask some thoughtful questions, had like it really made me feel like I'm going to say the word special because it was like, okay, wait, I have value. Like a person that is doing all of these different things still takes the time to talk with me and to go through a conversation like this with me. So that was one of the things that really made me go out there and try to like turn my life around, and I wanted to make that public appreciation for you taking the time to meet with me 2 years ago actually.
It was an honor, and thank you. It's an honor to be here as well. And yeah, the appreciation is very much mutual. I think it's the willingness to ask for help genuinely is an underrated skill. I think there's a profound vulnerability in that, and it makes a space for other people to show up at their best. So it's as much of a gift as it is something you're receiving.
Yeah. How much of that have you seen in your career? Like people having trouble asking for help even though they clearly need it from a business perspective?
Constantly.
I assumed.
Yeah, no, it's funny, right? If we want to jump right into more of the business side of it, right? It's a really common phenomena that I see, especially with leaders and often sort of their direct reports or other people, where they're just constantly saying, why didn't this person bring this to me? Like, why did they just keep banging their heads against the wall for 6 months and saying everything is fine when it wasn't? And then I discover later when it's so much harder to do anything about. And there is this deep need that I think many people have to keep themselves safe by sort of showing that they're fully competent, and competence translated as in no way in need of anything, and having perfect control of the situation, which if you're actually trying to accomplish any complex goal and you're actually sort of living at the edge of your potential is of course ridiculous. Like there's no way that you're actually pushing the edges of your potential and not running every day into something that throws you for a loop.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I want to go back to your journey, but let me ask you one extra question on that. Do you feel like vulnerability is more present in, or what's the relationship between vulnerability and leaders? Are leaders, because they're in a position of leadership, less prone to being vulnerable, or actually more prone to asking for help?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that I would draw a distinction specifically between
Got it.
leaders and other people in terms of vulnerability. There are people who are more
It's just
comfortable being
general.
vulnerable. There are people who are less comfortable with it. I think maybe the additional pressure that leaders have is there often is a narrative that they hold, and it's not necessarily a false narrative, that people are looking to them for some kind of comfort or stability, right? So I think there's a meme around sort of vulnerable leadership out there of just share what's in your heart and it's all going to be okay. And if someone comes out and says, okay, yeah, we're 3 weeks from running out of money and I have no idea where we're going to get it, and our product is screwed and I don't know why, and I have no idea how we're going to fix it, and I don't know, back to work, everyone. That also doesn't bring the best out of people,
Yeah.
right? It's actually, I think in some ways, there's an important dance that leaders have to make around how to invite in help, how to invite the best from people, how to bring reality to people. Because I think especially if you are running a high performance organization, you have people who want to engage, who want to help, who want to solve real problems and make an impact, and you have to create the space for them to be able to do that and be vulnerable enough to open that space, because vulnerability is a space giving at its best. It's saying, this is the edges of what I know, this is the edges of what I can do, and I actually need you to fill in those gaps with me. But at the same time, recognize the reality that we're social animals and we pattern off of each other's nervous systems, and holding that sense of, I don't know, this is hard. And there's a there. I still believe in what we're doing. There's still a line that we're following. There's something that we can follow together and come out the other side of. And holding that balance is delicate.
Yeah, very good answer. Thank you. So I want to go back to Jake as a person before going into like your business on Studio Metis. But like I was looking at your profile and like everything that you've done, and I was also looking at your website, and you have such an interesting description of yourself. So you say, this is in Studio Metis website, it says you're a hedge fund mind with a coach heart. Like, I would love to understand like the thinking behind this. Why you describing yourself that way?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thinking through how much of a detour to take here.
No,
There's,
please do.
yeah, there's lots of different ways of knowing. And I think that's a really important part of what it means to develop as a human being and to develop wisdom. And we tend to lock into sort of one way of knowing, usually because it makes us feel safe or valuable in some way. Being able to develop different ways of knowing, hold multiple ways of knowing simultaneously allows us to be a little more in a little more contact with a little more of reality, which gives us more space within which to operate, more space for creativity, and more space also for actual agency, because we're no longer as controlled by sort of a certain set of programs. So that's sort of a very headline answer to what you're asking. In terms of some of the frames that I've personally invested in developing that I find most valuable, I started my career at a big hedge fund called Bridgewater, working with Ray Dalio, doing a number of special projects, sort of trying to encode a version of how the entire world economic system works, which is both sort of a fascinating and hubristic project. But there's a way of seeing that comes along with that, where you are constantly applying the rigor of saying, is what I'm saying true? Is what I'm seeing true? How does this add up? If I look at the system as a whole, how does it need to balance? I may not be able to perfectly predict the path that any set of events will take, but I can see where there are imbalances, and I can be relatively sure that in some way they're going to resolve themselves. And there's both a systems view and a rigor to that view. Now, most of this, I think, is cognitive, that I do find really valuable. I think there's a lot of coaches out there who do primarily, I think, focus on more of the interpersonal or the subtle or the emotional side of the work, and that's great. There's no shade on anyone else. I think there's a lot of really beautiful work to be done in that space, but when that is divorced from the rigor of actually asking what is happening here, what is going on with this system, what do we need to do to win, what are we going for, what are the competitive pressures, what can we learn from the numbers that we see, from what we're measuring. Divorced from that, the other lenses don't really have much purchase. They don't have much way of actually sort of manifesting in the world or driving real action. So that lens of the rigor of the systems view is important to me. And at the same time, I think when that lens is always taken as primary, it just misses a lot, right? It sort of lies to itself, saying, I see all the things, right? Everything can have a number on it. Everything is a system. Everything can be abstracted. Everything can be held as a concept. When that's not how reality works. We're people trying to do stuff, and we have emotional worlds, we have social worlds, we have energetic worlds, we have ways of seeing and knowing that go far beyond what we can process cognitively. And if we don't attend to those, then we become sort of these hollow ghosts, right? We lose sight of why we're doing what we're doing, and we can get later into why that's an issue. And we also actually lose the ability to be effective because we're no longer actually able to execute things with other people, because we've lost access to our hearts, we've lost access to our bodies, we've lost access to all of these other ways of knowing that give us both better ways to know what's actually happening and better ways to relate to other people and how we do it, as well as ourselves. And so that heart to me is really critical, where in some ways I'm striving to take someone's potential more seriously than they take it themselves. Where I'm sort of looking at the acorn and envisioning the oak and constantly sort of cheering for it, and and maybe feeling the pain of where they're stuck or where something is frustrating or where they're confused. In some ways, maybe even more deeply than they're allowing themselves to feel in a given moment. And holding that and also being deeply okay with that in a way that hopefully opens up that space for them to do the same.
Well, first of all, that's such a good answer, and there's a lot to unpack in there. One of the things that I really loved how so before actually understanding that you were building Studio Metis, I was following you on Twitter, and I was aware of some of your background in investing in Bridgewater, etc. And but I always the reason why I always enjoyed your comments, your tweets, etc. was that I always find that balance, and I wasn't able to phrase it until actually understanding this, because I feel like that's something very rare. Having like these two different frameworks that are I think that people can try and have them, but to harmonize them in a way that's actually functional, I would say that it's a pretty hard thing to do. Like people can switch between them, I would say, but to actually have an harmony between the two things, that's I would say that's a very hard balance to have. How do you go about doing that? So, like I'm assuming that there's moments where the data tells you something even though the people are feeling something different, or there's a conflict between these two parts. How do you navigate that conflict and find a way to balance this perspective?
Oh man, it's such a good question. Okay, I'm going to answer on a couple different levels. One in terms of sort of capacity building for on my side, and more broadly, I think in terms of how we can do it as people, and then a bit about sort of practically how to do that, particularly maybe in a business case or something like that. So on call it the personal development side, it's really hard. That's the first answer. But it's also, I think, worth taking as the work in and of itself. So there's this Armenian mystic, G.I. Gurdjieff, that some of your listeners may have heard of. But he talks a lot about this notion of sort of harmonization between sort of different ways of seeing and knowing. There's lots of different ways that you can do that, and I think in some ways this is the heart of human development generally, right? So we have different parts, right? One part wants to go and tell someone off and ask exactly for what we want. Another part is afraid of conflict, right? Classic one. There's different ways of knowing, right? There's sort of conceptual frames that we may try to hold things in. There's emotions that we're feeling. There's sensations that we have in our body. There's intuitions or imaginal states that we may be drawing in. And like you said, it's really hard to hold them all. Like most of the time we just sort of toggle back and forth between them, right? And then we're sort of confused why we did that, right? It's like, oh, I want to go on a diet, and then I have a hard day and I like eat, 3 donuts, whatever. And I'm like, why did I do that? Or, I had a really hard day at work, and then my wife interrupts me for something, and she's like offering something nice, and I snap at her for and I'm like, why did I do that? And leaders do this all the time, right? They sort of set an intention and then they go and do something completely different. And everyone's like, why are you such a hypocrite? But they're not. They're just human beings who have different parts that aren't really particularly well harmonized. And most of the time, I think people experience these as conflicts, right? That it's like, there's this, and I don't know how to put them together, and it's unsolvable, and I just sort of toggle between them, and I feel sort of at the whim of this thing. It's sort of like you're in this storm all the time. And the Gurdjieffian view is that the practice, in many ways, is to be able to hold both. To be able to hold irritation because you really want to get something done and you're locked in, and a spaciousness to be with whatever comes up. And it's a little bit like an orchestra. If you're trying to put an orchestra together, you have all of these different instruments that you're trying to play. And most of the time, we do just sort of play them one by one. And so, you have the violin that plays, and then you have, the timpani or whatever it is. And then we just sort of vacillate between them, and that's just noise. That's actually not harmony. That's not a symphony. And the practice is, okay, can you get the violin and the cello and the timpani playing at the same time. And it's hard. Like this is actually it's if you actually try to do it, if you try to hold both fully, not like a compromise between them, but actually both fully feel your desire to be locked in and irritated with any interact disruptions, and your desire to be spacious and welcome the people coming in around you and all of that. If you really hold both of those fully, that's where the harmonization starts to happen, because they can kind of hear each other. And that's where it actually harmonizes into a new capacity.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Let me ask you so in that metaphor of the symphony and the orchestra, who would you say is the conductor? Is it the heart, the mind? Is it a combination of both? Like, who's actually trying to listen to all of the instruments and finding a way for it to actually be balanced?
Well, this you're like going right to the heart of things here. So this is my own view, obviously, like everything I'm saying, but I think you have to get a little bit mystic to answer that question, where the any attempt to put a conceptual wrapper around what the so-called conductor is will get sort of captured as just another programmed loop, which will be in turn just subject to sort of all the fears and the package of learned behaviors that you've developed over the course of your life. And by the way, it doesn't matter whether that's the heart or the mind or a particular part of your mind or whatever. Like, and I see this all the time, right? Where people are like, no, you just need to act from your heart. You just need to locate yourself in your body. And it's like, no, like the self, if we take more of a Buddhist perspective, like it's sort of an illusory thing, right? It's something that's actually constructed. And then the question is, what do you want to be constructing from? What is the thing that actually gives you any choice in that? And there is this thing where I think the only real choice we have is what to be devoted to. And then what is that higher thing that we want to be devoted to? You could say we're some conscious piece of the universe. I mean, it doesn't even need to be mystical. That's just literal. We are a conscious piece of the universe that is arising in a particular set of constraints based on sort of the time and the environment within which we're existing. And what wants to come through us when we identify more and more with that? When we see everything that's arising, whether it's our patterns, our yearnings, our fears, desires, different parts, sensory information, emotional information, conceptual information, when we see all of that as just, okay, we walk outside and we see the sun and we see leaves and we see pavement. Okay, great. Those are all just features of this container that this consciousness in our part of the universe is inhabiting. And it's the same with all our internal information. We just sort of privilege it in a particular way because that's sort of helpful for staying alive. But if we actually want to transcend that and make room for surprise, make room for deeper things to come through, make room for us to, in some way, be of service to something larger than ourselves, then we have to keep falling back more and more into, okay, right, this desire is just an arising. This fear is just an arising. This thing that I'm going to somehow control, the orchestration, is in and of itself just an arising. But perhaps I can align with some intent of there's something here that wants to grow through this thing that I'm calling me in this place that I happen to find myself.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and I feel like it's interesting because if you keep the musical perspective, I don't know if you remember this, but I studied music for a long time. I went to college to study music, and so the framework of looking at life through actual rules of musical harmony is something that I do a lot, and I feel like it's interesting because in the metaphor that you're asking, if you were to ask an actual conductor, he would tell you something similar, where he would say that what matters more than himself is the music. So a lot of people
Yes.
will say that, well, oh, that particular conductor is such a very good conductor. But if you ask them, he will say it's not about me. It's about being able to like use these musicians in order to serve the music better than maybe everyone else. And I feel like that's part of what you're saying, where it's like the focus is not so much on the conductor itself, but on aligning with what the music might require from all of these different instruments. And I would recommend, if people are listening, like go and check like the same symphony led by different conductors, and you'll notice the difference, because each one of them, even though the notes are exactly the same, it's classical music, it's all written down, you'll still hear the differences, and those differences are coming not from I would even say that it's not from the conductor itself, but the way that the conductor wants to manifest music in that moment. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I really enjoyed that answer.
It's a much better and your summary is much better and pithier than my word salad. It's I think
No, not at all.
you're following the music, like who's conducting the music, and I think that's and
Yeah.
there's something really important there, right? Because this applies also both to I think individual lives and to sort of founders or leaders or builders. Like the very best founders and leaders are in service of the thing that's being born through them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And now, a lot of people come with a lot of ego or a chip on their shoulder. And by the way, that's fine. That's actually how you access it at first. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's not like that's going to prevent you from doing it, because it takes a certain kind of madness to be like, no, like I'm going to go take on the world and create something from nothing. And it's not like you need to be some perfect enlightened being to be a good founder. And I think if you look at the track record of a lot of founders, that's not that's just empirically not how this
It's
works.
easy.
But over time, there is, I think, something where the very best founders are continually sort of reinventing both themselves based on listening to the music, based on what wants to come through, what is the soul of this organization, what wants to manifest here that is unique to whatever the spirit of the thing is that I've now called through.
Yeah.
and and where you see people go wrong is where it does become about them, and then their fears start to dictate it, right? So it's like, oh, I don't quite know where growth is going to come from, and I'm scared that we're going to top out at a certain revenue level, and people are going to think that I'm a has-been, blah, 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 blah. So I'm going to try to do all of these different things and force innovation across all of these different tracks. And like, no, that's you're just afraid. You're not actually listening for what wants to come through for this interaction between what the world is asking for and whatever this organism is that you've birthed into the world. And whereas I think the very best founders are very good at listening for that, of seeing, oh, the suite of technologies that's available right now is ready for the iPhone. And there's sort of this yearning for it out in the world, question mark around what that ultimately ends in. But like there's a way in which the best founders are listening for that. And then they're constantly both sort of bringing from the outside world what fits with that and continually refining the organization around them to be aligned with that, right? There is this just every organization sort of accumulates complexity, accumulates little battles and fiefdoms and bureaucracy and all of that. It's just inevitable with any human system. And there's sort of this constant act of pruning that good leaders are doing, saying, okay, is this aligned with what we want to be? Is this true to the core of what we want to build? Is this true to the soul of what we're doing? Have we simplified things down to being just a pure expression of that and not adding on all of this other stuff, mostly to sort of service my ego or fear?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great answer. And if you allow me to add just one extra thing around the music metaphor, I think that that's the difference between being a jazz musician and a classical musician, where like when you're at the stage of trying to connect all of these things and coming up with something new from scratch, I feel like you need to be way more like a jazz musician, where you're listening to the music and you're improvising based on what the music demands. That's something that I've had countless teachers say to me when we were playing music, like listen to what the music is asking for. And a lot of times, as a musician, you bring your ego into the equation. So you want to play really, really fast, and you want to play really good and showcase all of your skill. And that's great, because that's what allows you to then develop the capacity of, if the music demands you to play fast, you're able to do so. But you get to a point where it's like you play fast because the music is demanding, not because you want to showcase like how fast you can play. And I feel like that relationship with music is kind of similar with what you're saying, where it's like, yeah, we'll bring innovation at higher levels because that's what the context right now is asking for, not because I want to showcase to all of these people, look at how much innovation I can bring to a company. And having that self-awareness is extremely, I would say that is extremely important for a jazz musician and for a founder as well.
100%. And there's something I think really important in what you're saying about the role of ego and ambition in how you do that, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's the ambition is at its best to be worthy of the music, right?
Yeah.
Like, no, I'm going to sort of put in the extra reps practicing my scales, and I'm going to keep doing those annoying exercises to strengthen my fingers because, and like, yeah, and listen, maybe that's coming from a place of ego or ambition. Maybe it's like, yeah, I want to be the best jazz guitarist in the world, and I want everyone to know just how great I am. Great, okay, fine, that's fuel. Mm-hmm. But then the point is, what do you burn it in service of? And when you burn it in service of the music, that's where the magic happens.
Yeah. That's a beautiful answer. That's such a great way to put it. Okay, so I want to go back to actually Studio Metis, and try to understand. Actually, no, I want to ask you something first, because I think that that's a great bridge between what we're talking and Studio Metis, which is you seem to have like this tendency in looking at like your track record from a professional standpoint. You started in Bridgewater Associates, you were director in Slow Money, you started to found a bunch of different projects around consulting, coaching, like dealing with talent. Can you help me understand, how did you develop this relationship with coaching? Like, was that something that you were always inclined to? Was that always a role that you enjoyed having? Was it something that you ended up building upon later in life? Like, how did that start?
Yeah, I mostly came into it kicking and screaming. So I landed in Boulder at Colorado after doing a bit of a sort of walkabout post Bridgewater, and Boulder is a bit of a mecca for coaches and things like that. And like when I first heard coaching, I was just like, what nonsense is that? Like, you just mean unlicensed therapy? Like, what are we talking about? And I was and sort of that's how I sat with it for a while, uncharitably, and I ended up going through in my sort of late 20s this sort of really, really challenging health episode for 3 years, where I had and basically it was in many ways, I don't know if you want to call it an ego death or something like that, where I was just basically in pain all the time, couldn't walk most days, could barely read a page in a book. And so everything that I sort of knew of myself, all of the capacities by which I sort of made sense of myself in the world and sort of could soothe myself, telling myself, oh, I'm valuable for these reasons, people need me for these reasons, that was all gone. And I had, basically ran through all of my savings and had no money, so it was very real too. And like it was, and the doctors, by the way, were also saying, by the way, you may never recover, so, settle in. And a lot of credit to my wife, who's just an amazing, deeply sensitive, deeply intuitive person, who sort of brought me into all of these different practices that people were doing in Boulder, different meditation modalities, something called circling, which is sort of like an interpersonal meditation. Ended up working with this really extraordinary sort of parts work guy, down 85. He created a lot of this stuff down in the deserts of Arizona, and found through that experience that, it sounds maybe a bit like a cliche, but just like how powerful presence itself is, that there was something really valuable to just being with people and just listening fully and welcoming whatever was there and wherever they were at, as well as whatever was in myself. And when my health came back, there was this question, going back to what you were saying about harmonization or integration, where, you know, the ambition, the rigor, all that like came back online, right? And like, okay, what do I do? I'm holding both of these things where it's like my heart is blasted open. I'm like deeply sensitive now, you know, and a lot of these, I think, by the way, like a lot of these seeds had always been there. I was a very sensitive kid. I've always sort of enjoyed being there for people in difficult moments in different ways. So it's not like this was out of nowhere. I think that had always been there in some way. But there was this question of like, okay, how do I bring this sort of love of glory and ambition and big things in the world to this deep love of stillness and connection and emergence? And the answer, which, you know, which I sort of grudgingly accepted, was coaching. You know, and I think there's a bit of a perennial role, I think, in society for people who navigate liminal spaces at the edges of the tribe, if you will. You know, sometimes people talk about that as a shaman, a rabbi. Sometimes, you know, gets formalized into a priesthood of some kind. Sometimes it's sort of your hermetic mystics. Different flavors, different cultures, different ways that manifests at different points. But there's this thing where it's like, hey, everyone has to kind of do their thing to just make society work. And by and large, like actually questioning the foundations of that is not particularly useful. Like just, you know, go plant your fields and, you know, pay your taxes and like don't ask too many questions. And that's like actually like a pretty functional way to hold society together most of the time. But there are these sort of liminal spaces around the edges of those frames where there is a need for something else. And that may be an individual liminal space where someone goes through, you know, they get divorced, they go through a horrible illness, they, you know, lose a child, some sort of really horrific thing where their existing frames for how to make sense of the world just no longer work. And they're sort of thrust naked into that liminal space. And having people who sort of just hang out in that liminal space all the time is very helpful to kind of guide them through that. And then that becomes, I think, even more important when you're talking about liminal spaces between civilizations, which I think is where we're at right now. You know, we're sort of in this time between worlds, right? Where you could talk about historically, you can talk about financially, but we're sort of in this liminal space in what it means to be human and the structures by which we make sense of the world and ourselves and how we organize. And it is particularly important, I think, in these moments for there to be people who put a lot of their attention and time on how to navigate these liminal spaces and how to bring other people along on that ride. And so coach, to me, at its best, which, by the way, is not always what it is, in the same way that all words kind of get bastardized in a marketing context, but coach at its very best to me is just a continuation of that lineage. It's sort of it's a calling at its best to help people navigate that liminal space in themselves and in the world.
Yeah, that's such a great and thoughtful answer. So, and I think it does work as a bridge to Studio Metis. And so I'll start with like in your the basic question is, of course, what the business is. But you say in your website that our mission is to live up to the name of our firm. So maybe you can start by sharing what Studio Metis is and also what you mean by this mission of living up to the name of your firm.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are we? Question that we're constantly asking ourselves. Legibility, not a strong suit. If there are any marketers out there who want to help us, we welcome your guidance. But I think the way that we're currently framing it is, you know, we're really looking to enable collective agency, which, you know, maybe sounds a bit conceptual, and in some ways it is, but it's like, at the end of the day, the thing that enables what we were talking about, for to follow the music, you need people to be able to do stuff together, right? You have to assemble the band. You got to have the right instruments. You have to build the container in which they're able to play together, right? Maybe you need to be able to have an audience and promote it such that there's actually that sort of interaction and there's someone to hear the music. That's a container for collective agency. And right now, I think if you look around the world, collective agency is really hard, right? You look at something like, I think everyone by and large has this sense of like, I just don't know how to do things. It's sort of fascinating. I was talking to someone working, trying to disrupt the health system, and he'll go and talk to hospital CEOs, and they're like, oh, I love what you're saying, and it's totally right, but like, I don't know if I can do it because I need my doctors to be bought in, I need the insurers to be bought in, maybe the policy, blah, 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 blah. And then you go and talk to the policy people, and they're like, well, but we need the hospital CEOs on board. And then you go and talk to the insurers, and like, well, we would do this, but actually we need the regulators on board. And there's just this thing where everyone is convinced that they can't do anything, and they have to wait for someone else's permission, but no one actually knows who can do anything or who can give permission for what. And we just end up in this sort of really sort of pathetic standstill across huge swaths of society where, it's like we can't, in New York, I don't know what it is. It's like, I think it's 7 billion per mile of subway or something like that. And so they just can't build stuff. We can't do things. And this is where civilizations go to die, when governments can no longer mobilize people on projects, when companies can no longer mobilize people to create things. Like, this is where civilizations go to die. And I think it's a reason actually that ambitious people are so attracted to startups now, because it's in some ways one of the few remaining containers for collective agency, where you can actually get a group of people together and say, this is what we're doing, this is where we're going, this is how we're going to do it. Great, let's go. Okay, great, we did it. Now we're getting feedback from the market. Okay, we iterate, we go and do it again. Like, there's an actual loop where you're able to pick a direction and do stuff. That's it. That's what collective agency means. But how you enable that is a big question, and that's what we're trying to do. How do you help people to set a very clear intent, whether as an individual or as a group? That goes back a bit to the different parts and wanting different things and being incongruent. Like, how do you actually get really clear on not what you think you should do or what you are afraid you need to do or what you think your board wants you to do, but like, no, what is the thing? What actually needs to come through? And how do you actually get that intent to sort of flow throughout an entire org? Okay, great. And then what is the form that needs to take? This is where we get maybe more into the structural aspects of maybe how you design a team. What are the right executives? What roles do they need to have? What is their mandate? It's amazing how often this is actually really unclear. It's like, oh, what does your CTO do? Oh, she does technology. What do you mean?
What does that mean? Yeah.
What does that mean? Like, oh, is it the vision for the technology? Is it the roadmap? Is it coordinating the projects? Is it laying out the architecture? Is it the data structure? Is it bringing in new innovations? Like, what do you mean? What is the thing that this person does to achieve the shared intent that you have? And how does it fit within the rest of the team? And then there's a broader org context, right? Where, who makes decisions about what happens? Is it country level general managers who have a ton of autonomy to set a budget and make decisions based on local taste? Is it set centrally at a corporate headquarters? Is it like, there's all of these questions that you can go through. And most of the time, this stuff is actually just really ambiguous, or it's built in a way based on, how stuff just kind of organically grew that accumulates a bunch of gunk in between. Or what you often see is that, like, no one really quite knows, and everyone is waiting around for other people. And you have founders who say things like, I don't understand, why is it so hard to get stuff done? I'm just asking for new whiteboards in the office. Why is this so hard? Like, I don't understand. And then if you go and talk to people, it's like, well, because, we have a vendor approval process and, someone needs to sign off on it, but that person is out on leave at the moment. And like, I don't know who makes that decision in the interim. So actually there's like this council of people, but actually, the head of HR wants to weigh in because it affects both. And it's just like, sorry, what? You just need to buy new whiteboards. Like, why is this so hard? And so So starting then, so with collective agency, okay, great. You need some sort of shared intent that's actually aligned with the soul of what you're trying to build. Then you need to actually have a form that fits that, where you've clearly defined who does what. You've clearly defined the trade-offs. You understand the parts where there are going to be tensions, and maybe you're just, holding the right tensions, right? It's like, great. Sales will always want to say that you're doing stuff that's like a little ahead of what you actually have. Product will always want to have things done in a very predictable way that they can kind of control, and please don't overpromise, blah, 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 blah. That's a tension. Fine. That's never going away. But then be very clear about that and design your org such that it's very clear how those handoffs and those trade-offs are going to be managed. And then there's the actual doing of it, right? Where you, in my language, you create a container for action, right? And this is a lot of the plumbing that, oftentimes maybe seems dull, but it's like, okay, what meetings are happening when? When are we doing our quarterly planning? Who needs to be involved in what? But that stuff really matters because that's actually where things happen. Like you can have the right intent, you can have the right form. If you don't actually have containers for execution that everyone kind of understands and that they're able to do as much as possible without having to wonder how it's going to work, that's where you actually start getting collective agency, where intent is able to flow through to actual action and results. And so the work that we do is that we set that up. We help clarify the intent. We help clarify the form. We help put the right execution structures in place. We keep looping on that because it's not one and done, right? You have to actually see, how does this work? How are you going to implement it? How are you going to deal with people's hurt feelings because something was taken away from them, or maybe they don't believe in the new direction, or blah, 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 blah. And that work is, going back to the notion of integration or harmonization, something that requires, I think, sort of this multi-perspectival view, because it's not just strategy, but it is strategy, right? And it's not just org design, but it is org design. And it's not just coaching in terms of people dealing with their emotional landscapes and their blind spots and how they work with others, but that is a very important part of how it's all going to come together. And so that was the idea that initially brought Darko and I together of, okay, how do you bring all of these different tools, all of these different perspectives together in service of creating collective agency?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I feel like that answers one of the questions that I had, which was like how is the coaching at Studio Metis different from the regular coaching that you see? One of the things that I would love to understand is like, of course, that if you're holding space to understand each of the businesses or each of the leaders that are working with you, there's no single like way of doing things. You're understanding what that company needs and then adjusting based on that, I would assume. But walk me through what's like the basic structure for when you interact with a new client. So how's your process, and what the actually what the actual structure looks like when you're working with the new customer?
Yeah, listen, I mean, it depends. It obviously depends on the client. There's different scopes of projects, right? Sometimes it's just working with an executive team for a relatively short amount of time around something relatively specific, clarifying the strategy and a few key organizational decisions. Sometimes it's a much longer engagement, maybe for a year, even 2 or 3, where it's like, no, we're actually your ongoing partners and continuing to refine this system. In terms of the mechanisms, I don't think there's anything that would be like wildly surprising to you, right? We talk to people, we put together diagnoses, we run workshops, we bring people together, we have coaching sessions with individuals or groups. We put together, we help put together documents, exploring different ways to bring AI into that or bring technology into that, but that's a frontier right now. So, the actual mechanics of it, I don't think are anything wildly interesting.
Yeah, which is the way, like, which makes it proves the point that it's not about like the actual structure, but how you feel in that structure, and you have a bunch of different principles and ideas that I feel like are extremely interesting. So for the people listening, both Jake and Darko have a Substack called The Last Manager, where you guys wrote down a bunch of different ideas that are part, I would assume, of Studio Metis philosophy, and I want to go over some of them as a way to showcase the kind of, once again, different ideas that maybe permeate these mechanics that are similar to other types of companies, and yet it's because you imply and use these principles that maybe things are slightly different. And one of them that I really enjoy was that around the idea of simplicity, and simplicity as a key to scaling greatness. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about that. Like, what would you say the simplicity role is?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it makes me think of the Mark Twain quote, right? It's like I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have time. Like simplicity takes work, right? Because it requires a real clarity of intent and a willingness to actually make hard calls about what sort of is and isn't in it, right? And most of the time, what you see in organizations is there's a desire to de-risk what you're doing by trying a bunch of different stuff, right? And there's a desire generally not to upset anyone, and that takes the form of, okay, well, you can do this and you can do this and you can do that. And then there's also usually this mechanism by which you have kind of organizational trauma where, one person abuses their expense account and now you need a policy for expenses going forward that's really heavy. And you sort of accumulate these layers of process based on things that have happened in the past. And simplicity is about really saying no to all of that. It's actually sort of saying, okay, great. And again, these questions are simple, but they take real attention and discipline to answer well. So how do we create value, right? Like, what are we doing that solves anything for anyone, right? Like, why do we have any reason to exist? What do we do for anyone? Like, we offer cloud computing that's marginally cheaper. Okay, I guess, maybe. Like, is the cheaper than the thing? Is it the reliability? Is it the access? What is it that you're actually providing people? What is it that you make possible for them? Oh, you let them buy cloud computing in a way that requires very little attention from them. Oh, so you're freeing up their attention to focus on their business. That's what you're doing. You're delivering technology that allows them to run more and more of their operation in the background so that they can spend time focused on what they actually need to be doing. Okay, that's actual value. Okay, what's aligned with that, right? Let's look through all of your projects, right? Let's look through all of the initiatives that you're doing. What is closest to that? And listen, people aren't dumb, right? I think in companies, there'll always be a good enough reason for everything. It's not like it's very, very rare that you look through all the activities that you're doing and you're like, oh, well, that's just completely pointless. There's always some business case, there's always some justification, but that's where it gets back to that part of sort of the deep listening and the clarity of intent, where you hold that bar of like, really, is that really enough? Is that really, if we can really only do one thing or two things, is that in the one or the two?
Yeah.
There's this great anecdote from when Intel was going through a really hard time and they needed to pivot their business, where Andy Grove at the time goes like, okay, guys, we're going to go out of the room, and when we come back in, we're going to behave as if the management team, meaning us, were just fired and we have to come in and fix things and like just make some really hard calls about what we actually need to do. And I think it's a great anecdote because there is this way that people get attached to the status quo and to business as usual and don't actually ask the question of what actually is producing anything of value to anyone. And then the deeper question of what is aligned with the soul of this business? What lights us up? Why are we here? Right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of part one. right? And then part two is just like, great, what's the simplest way to do that? Oh, do you need a 20-person senior leadership team because you want to make people feel special without promoting them to the C-suite? Like,
Yeah.
no, like that doesn't make this better. Actually, like form groups that focus on specific initiatives, give one person ownership of it for a given result, and like go.
Yeah.
Or identify the key tensions and give an owner for each tension so that it's aligned with the thing that you're trying to create. Like again, it's none of these things are radically complex in and of themselves, and that's sort of the point of simplicity. It's more that it's hard to do the simple things because the fears come up. What if, oh God, if we cut that project, does that mean that we're not going to have this growth avenue in the future? Or, oh, the board really wants us to focus on profitability, but like this is going to kill the basic engine of what we're doing. But like I don't quite know how to navigate. It's like, well, it sounds like you need to have a conversation with your board. There's all of these things that happen that are more often less a question of knowing what to do and more about having the courage to do it.
Yeah, it's almost like we hide ourselves under like a layer of complexity in order to justify not like dealing with the actual simple but very emotional issues that need to be solved in order to move forward. That it makes a lot of sense. In fact, one of the things that really resonated with me from that article that you guys wrote is this idea of put excellence before comfort,
Yes.
which might seem like a very obvious thing, but it's not, because a lot of companies, like when you're actually trying to make excellent work, you need to be willing to have these uncomfortable conversations, because excellence will demand of you to do uncomfortable things, right? Because if you didn't, anyone could be excellent, and excellence would lose its purpose, I would say. So you do actually need to be ready to have these uncomfortable things. And one of the things that I'm really understanding is that, once again, going back to that idea of the edge fund mind and the coach heart, is maybe you guys allow for this emotional landscape that allows for those conversations to happen in a way where, yeah, this is a simple question. It's hard emotionally speaking to have this conversation, but we have these people here that are allowing us to build this emotional landscape where at least it will make it safe. It's like
Yes.
I'm comfortable enough to have this conversation, even if it's extremely uncomfortable. And maybe that's one of the things that you guys do very differently, right? Where it's like we're it's not so much bringing more complexity into the system; it's actually peeling away the onion into its core, but doing so in an environment where you get to be emotional, and it's because you get to be emotional that you get to the core of what you're doing.
It's, you're really excellent at synthesis, by the way. I think you have a real gift for it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's it's certainly what we aspire to do. And the thing you note about it's not about bringing more complexity, it's about actually bringing simplicity, which often sounds basic. It's I think it's right, and it's something that I often wrestle with, right? Because I have sort of a whatever you want to call it, an ego drive or something to like stand out, right? I want to be seen as brilliant or insightful or dropping that insight that's going to blow people's minds because they've never heard it before. And and I think the information marketplace tilts towards that, right? There's
Yeah.
everyone's competing for attention. And it's like, oh, what's the hook? What's the new frame that's going to blow people's minds and contradict everything they've ever heard before and give some sort of notion that you have access to some truth that no one else has. When the the reality that I have to keep bringing myself back to as a bit of a practice is like most of this stuff is simple. It's a lot of perennial wisdom. It's stuff that, sure, if said without real intent behind it, can sound like fortune cookies, right? You know,
Yeah.
follow love, put attention on the things that create value. make the
Yeah.
hard choices even when they're uncomfortable. Like, come on, like, blah, like it's so like if that's but those are the things. Those
Yeah.
are the actual things. And then the deep question is actually how are we going to go beyond the what feels the need to sort of be distinct or try to sort of shock the system to actually hear the deeper wisdom that's embedded in these kinds of perennial frames.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that maybe contributes to that is that people sometimes have this misconception of simplicity equaling something that's easy, and that's not the case. But it might get tangled in their minds where, oh, because this is so simple, then it's easy, and if it's easy, this cannot be the answer. But these are very two different things. Like going back to the example of the music, well, just follow the music. That's
Yeah.
simple. It's not easy at all, right? So I feel like people sometimes have this resistance to simplicity because of it, because they're mistaking these two things, or they're mistaking something being simple as being easy, and in their brains they're like, well, if it was easy, like our organization would already be at this given level, or my project will already be at this given level, so this might not be the answer. And funnily enough, they kind of dive into more and more complexity, and that ends up actually hindering the speed and range of action that they have, either as individuals or organizations. But it's funny because one of the things that I feel like it's important in order to deal with this complexity, or in order to, sorry, scale simplicity, is to understand complexity. In fact, you have such a very an interesting article where it's called channeling an attractor from the future, once again in the last manager substack from Studio Metis, where you go into this concept of complexity science, the concept of the notion of attractor, which I would love for you to explain. But what I found interesting was that how interesting that I'm reading an article on how important scaling simplicity is, just followed by an article talking about complexity science. But I feel like that's what I, once again, going back to having these very two different frames being so well balanced. And so I guess my question is, can you go over a little bit on your relationship with complexity science and how that may actually help you scale simplicity? And if you want to touch on the notion of attractors and what you mean by channeling an attractor from the future, maybe that's a good idea as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, rocks are simple. Real, it's just a repeating chemical structure. It looks more or less the same, really predictable set of sort of outputs and inputs in terms of how they're going to behave. That's interesting to a point. Maybe some people really, really love rocks, but for me, that's sort of not the spice of existence.
Yeah.
Like what makes me so delighted to be alive is growth, is this just like this explosion of life all around me, which is complexity, right? Like the universe started out as just like a relatively uniform, really hot gas cloud, super simple, like great, that's sort of undifferentiated. And from a mystic lens, right, like that is sort of the higher spiritual realms are just this sort of undifferentiated potential, which is incredibly simple. Life growth is this accumulation of complexity, that there's this discovery of niches, this building of more and more and more complex structures for how inputs and outputs are managed and how things interact within these broader systems. And like, that's what life is. Life is this sort of complexifying motion that is sort of locally anti-entropic. It's actually pushing against simplicity. It's building more structure and more differentiation. And that's so cool. Like that's like, to me, like when you feel it, when you feel life just like adding and exploring and differentiating and coming together and crashing, like that's the beauty of life. And if we go back to collective agency, if you want to do stuff, you then do need to somehow recover the simplicity on the other side of that. Right?
Yeah.
And oh, this plant wants to grow. Okay, does it have enough sun? Does it have enough water? Is it in soil that makes it happy? Okay, great, simple. So simplicity, to me, the simplicity on the other side of complexity is very different than the simplicity before complexity. It is that harmonization. It's what happens once you've had differentiation and then you bring it back together into something that's harmonized.
Yeah.
And that's where you can actually act, right? Because if you're in a purely complex system, it's really hard to act. And I fall into this trap all the time, right? That's your sort of classic analysis paralysis. What about this factor? And what about that factor? And wait, if I move this thing moves. And I don't know. And blah, 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 blah. And like, you can just swirl in that. It's actually very hard to be agentic in that. It's hard to have a clear intention. It's hard to take action because you just swirl in all of the factors and all of the unknowns. And there's no, and if going back to sort of different ways of seeing, if you're trying to just do that with your mind, you're lost.
Yeah.
Because your mind can't process it.
Yeah.
And so what is the attractor? It's where you say, great, I see all these things, and what is that song? It's not just notes. It's not just rhythm. It's not just vibrations on strings. There's a music on the other side of all of that. And I'm not going to get there with my mind. I'm going to hear it. And maybe it hasn't even been played yet, right? It's the next note. I'm hearing the next note. That's the attractor from the future. It's I've heard all of this stuff, and maybe there's discord, right? Like there's this great quote from Miles Davis about like it's the, what matters. There's no wrong note. You can play a string of stuff that sounds totally discordant, and then you play the chord that resolves it all, and everyone's like, "Whoa, brilliant!" Right? That's the attractor from the future. It's listening for the next note on the other side of the complexity that brings it all together into something beautiful. And to me, beauty is the North Star there. Beauty is that place where it comes together. More than love, more than judgment, more than yin, more than yang. Like beauty is the place where all of the complexity resolves itself into one beautiful thing.
Yeah. That is such a great answer, and there's so many things coming to my mind. One of them is, it's interesting because the quote that you mentioned by Miles Davis is actually it's great. Like you play all of these weird notes, and then the chord comes in and kind of combines them all together. But it's interesting because the opposite can also happen. Like Herbie Hancock, which was a jazz pianist that played a lot with Miles Davis, he wrote a book called Possibilities. He's a Buddhist, and so he kind of in the book he goes through his own tale and relates to spirituality with the music itself. And so he retells a concert where he was actually playing with Miles, and they were playing this very simple tune called "So What." It's just basically two chords, but they're immediately they're just very close together, which in music that means that they're very different. Okay, they may seem very similar, but they're very different. And Herbie just played the wrong chord at the wrong time, and so he kind of froze. He took his hands of the keyboard, but in the piano you have like these three pedals, and one of them, if you keep pressing it down on your feet, even though you take your hands from the piano, the sound keeps reverberating. And so he played that wrong chord, and he got really scared, but he panicked, and so he didn't take the foot off. So it was just like that mass of dissonant sound live in the Miles Davis quintet. And Miles was playing, and he stopped. He listened to the chord, and he played this beautiful line that made the chord sound beautiful. And so I feel like it's important to understand that both like the harmony, the chords can make the line sound good, but the opposite is also true. Like you can have like a chord that doesn't sound good, and by your individual actions you can make it so that actually makes sense. At the same time, one of the things that really popped into my head is that maybe the difference between simplicity as an easy thing and the simplicity after the complexity is that as you go through things, as you go through complexion or complexity, if you're able to integrate all of that complexity into you, that makes it kind of creates a simplicity that's very different from the simplicity that you were mentioning, right? Where it's like simplicity is almost like this integration of all of the complex elements in a way that actually makes sense, which is such an interesting insight. And the last comment that I have for your answer is, it's funny because when I was getting ready for it, I do this with all of the guests. After getting the questions ready and going through the profiles and the articles, etc., I think about what are some of the words that I associate with this person, or values that I would associate. So it's funny because I wrote down two for you. One of them you mentioned it quite sometimes in the conversation already, which was wisdom, and the other one was beauty. And so I'm happy to see that both of them were somehow mentioned in the conversation, because I really enjoy that view of beauty being the guiding principle. I guess that one practical question that I would have is, what are some of the actions or principles or beliefs that you have that kind of allow you to make sure that that's the case, that you're following beauty, or that beauty is the most important thing? Like, practically, how does that come about in your life?
Mm. Every moment is an opportunity, and an opportunity to listen deeper. You talk about the cord hanging in the air and the freeze. It actually made the space then for Miles to follow up.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I'm in conflict with someone and losing perspective and I'm just feeling wronged and judgmental and all of that, it's like, what do I not want to see? What do I not want to listen to? What's here? It's really hard to access sometimes, right? But habituating that practice of, okay, something's activated. There's something to listen to. And maybe it's not the first thing. Maybe it's not, oh, I need to set a boundary, right? That's therapy speak, which I have my issues with. It's like, no, actually, I feel powerless, and I really, really care about this person, and I really am attached to the outcome, and I want to help however I can. I don't know how. Mm-hmm. And maybe if I feel into that, maybe I can share that if it's appropriate. Maybe I can feel into, there are limits to what I can do right now, and I can accept that. Maybe I can feel into, there are limits in what I can see, and so maybe it's about putting myself in a position where I have to listen deeper, because maybe there's more coming through than I'm allowing myself to feel and see and do.
That's a very powerful, beautiful answer. Yeah, it resonates. I feel like you're a very congruent person. Like, you're very coherent into your words, your actions, the way you articulate. Just and I feel like that answer is like the culmination of all of the things that we've been basically talking about. I could talk with you for hours. I have just so many other questions, but I want to be respectful for your time. So I have one last question I would love to ask you, Jake. In your website, and I want to get this right, in your website, you mentioned this idea in Metis, which I feel like it might be, I don't know Darko, but I feel like to have this idea has to be something that it's both embodied by the organization, but also by you and him personally, which you said that you want to help the people that work with you find greatness at scale. And my last question before we go is, how do you define greatness?
it's an ever increasing capacity to hold what the universe is asking of us. Which we will be doomed to fail at in some ways.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Jake, well, I can't thank you enough for this conversation. Not just because it's going to be a hell of an episode, but I've taken so many notes and I've learned so much by talking with you. I'm really grateful that you took the time. One last question before we wrap up. If people want to connect with you, if people want to follow you, if people want to interact with you, what are some of the best avenues to do that?
Yeah, I mean, you can follow the Substack, the Last Manager. You can, well, I'm going to make a terrible mistake here and put my email on the internet. You can email me at jake@studiometis.co. That's co, not com. You can follow me on Twitter at JL Bornstein. To be clear, my Twitter is completely unhinged and doesn't really focus on anything in particular. So, I follow at your own risk. So I think those are probably the best ways for now. I'm going to be continuing to experiment with different ways to put more things out. But for now, those are the entry points.
Beautiful. We'll leave the links in the description and we'll leave the email to those who actually listen to the whole show to make sure that it's not as easy as everything else. Well, Jake, thank you so much for taking the time. This was a wonderful conversation. I feel like, once again, I told you this, I feel like you're extremely aligned, and to be speaking with someone that's as aligned as you are is extremely inspiring. And hopefully, like it was to me, and that's the whole reason why I do the podcast. But I truly believe that other people will benefit from our conversation as well, and from everything that you have to say. So thank you so much for taking the time. And yeah, it was such a great pleasure.
Thank you. I feel deeply honored, and I feel like you see the best in me, which is also a way that it gets brought out. So thank you for that.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you to everyone listening. Please go and follow Jake, and if you can, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Leave a like, a comment, and a rating on Spotify, and I'll see you all here in the next episode. Thank you so much, Jake. Once again, thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.